Hi, my name is Elliot Friedlander. I work with Save the Children. After having 10 years worth of data and 5 years worth of data in the case of Wazo, have you had any opportunity to analyze the data across the years? And if so, what changes, if any, have you seen in the children's reading rates?
Great. Let's take a couple more questions if there are. There. Why don't you grab those two here since you're close, and we'll pick up in a minute.
I'm Maisie. I'm a consultant with 3IE. We're conducting a systematic review of education effectiveness. My question's for Rukmini. You mentioned people that have potential objections to your work, and I was wondering if you could elaborate on them, and if they are on any way reflection on the challenges you face in conducting these assessments, or perhaps the challenges you face in promoting the results.
Is there one more here? Yeah.
So hi, my name is Yuki from the Children's Investment Fund Foundation, and I work in the evaluation unit. So I'm very interested in how do you define success in terms of driving accountability, driving demand by the citizen and responses from policymakers, and how do you go about measuring that?
Great. Let's take one more because I feel badly for not recognizing you before. Yeah. And you have to think of good answers here.
Will there be another round for that?
There will be, yeah. But why don't you ask?
Do you want me to?
Introduce yourself.
Okay, my name's Dave Banks. I've worked for 34 years in London schools, London Comprehensive Schools as a teacher and a manager. And also the last 3 years I've worked in Ghana as, setting up a teacher training programme, working with districts to improve the quality of teaching and learning. And I guess I've got a question, but it's kind of a statement now, and there were a couple of people to start off with, sorry for getting names, guys, that I would take issue with the fact that actually in education we don't know what quality is, because I think we absolutely do. We're very clear about what comprises quality in classrooms. First of all, it's not a woolly kind of thing, it's very clear. And good quality lessons have engagement, they have pace, they have good quality questioning, and a whole load of things which I could talk about a lot more. So I disagree, and I think that the way that you begin your work with improving the quality of teaching and learning is not by assessment at all. You begin in the classroom working with teachers in the sort of way that Kwame Achampong, for example, in Ghana has done, the sort of way that Stephen Alexander advocates. And that's the way that you begin, by working with teachers in classrooms, and you begin to improve the quality of teaching and learning, you raise standards, and then you can assess children, because otherwise you're assessing underachievement. And it is undoubtedly, if we've exported anything bad in education, we exported the god of assessment around the world. And of course, Michael Gove, I'm sure, will be smiling wherever he is. I'm sure he's picking up the message. And sorry to be disagreeable, but from my point of view as an educationalist, as a teacher and a manager, that isn't the way that you begin working with teachers, because it is liable to alienate them. So I guess there isn't a question there. Sorry, I do apologise for breaking the rules. But as Michael Apple says, it's important to have at least one professional remembrancer at every meeting. So thank you.
Thanks, really appreciate. I think, having a lively debate is much, much better than having everybody kind of either disagree in silence or agree. So with now sort of 4 points, maybe turn to Rukmini first and then Sarah. And then Joe, if you have additional
So I'd like to begin with a statement.
Yeah.
Recently, I was speaking at some conference, and I said that it's really important to teach children from where they are and move. Now, this in India has a certain meaning, and there was a gentleman in the audience from South Africa. And after the talk was over, he came to me and said, I think I said it's important to teach children at the right level. And so he said that he had a point of view somewhat like yours, and he said, what is the right level? So I said, well, maybe that was the wrong way to say it, but what I meant was teach children from the level where they are, because they can't move ahead otherwise. And he said, well, all teaching is like that. I said, teaching in my country is not like that. And the teachers are not to blame in that, because the curriculum has been set by people who are away from where the teaching and learning happens. And as a result, if you think of my 5th grade teacher, and let us assume, like we do, that teachers are just like anybody else. There are good teachers, there are bad teachers, and they're no different from anyone else. My 5th grade teacher in India comes into the class, and our teaching, I agree with you that good teaching is what you described, but that's not what our teachers are trained, that's not what our structure expects from our teachers. They are expected as a 5th grade teacher to pick up the 5th grade textbook and teach that. That's what our norm is. I'm not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing, but that's what it is. The 5th grade textbook is way above the capability of 90% of the children, not because of any fault of the children, but because it has been set at a standard that it is going to be very difficult to reach. I think it was Dana, who is sitting in the audience, who was once traveling with me in India, and we were in the state of Assam. And we were talking to the head teacher, and she picked up the 2nd grade English textbook in eastern state in Assam. And I still remember, she looked at it and she said, her sister is a 2nd grade teacher in California. This English textbook is far higher than what her sister teaches. So, there are these kinds of structural issues. And I think to some extent, what the USSR type of work has been able to do is to really bring this out in a very, it may seem like a very brutal way, but I think that's one of the reasons why teachers have not objected to what we say, because this is actually speaking for them to say, I need to teach children from where they are. You have to allow me to teach the children from where they are, rather than teach the curriculum. I need to teach children and not the curriculum. And in the case of South Africa, that's not far away. Both the things are together. In the case of India, the distance is high. And Land Pritchett, who's an economist, he wrote a paper, which you don't have to read, because the title is so good, it tells you everything about the paper. And the title of the paper is The Negative Consequences of Overambitious Curriculum. And what we are doing to our kids is we are leaving more and more kids behind even before they've started. And then parents will blame teachers and teachers will blame parents, and actually none of them are to blame. It is this structure that we've created for ourselves. I'm not sure why we've done it. So one of the things that we hope from what we are doing, and we see this flexibility within states, is to try different things which brings teaching and learning to start. You may finish very, very high, but you cannot start but where the kids are, because you need, it's common sense. But going back very quickly to some of the other questions, change over 10 years, yes, there is analysis. The analysis shows that learning levels are going down more in math than in reading. It was kind of stuck till about 2010, and then it's going down. When this came out, everybody, of course, blames, the nice thing in India is there's always somebody else to blame. So you blame sampling, because most people don't know sampling. So you think that must be wrong. There must be something fundamentally wrong in the way you're doing it. But year on year, when you have data that's coming out from 600,000 children, there's been very serious discussions within and outside the government about why this may be the case. Coincidentally, the right to education law came into place in 2010. Now, did that loosen up something in the system that, we don't have the answer, but you can see that. And I think that each subsequent, if you look at even though these are cross-sections and repeated cross-sections, if you look at each cohort, even if it's an artificial cohort, each cohort's trajectory seems to be a little bit lower than the previous one. 10 years of data can tell you that, if this was far apart. And our national assessment that is done, it has changed between the assessments. I think Maria is sitting here who knows that data really well. So you can't make these comparisons over time. There have been questions asked in Parliament about, can this be true? We are spending more and more money on education. Can this happen? So I think there is something to be said for over 10 years. You look at our over 10 years analysis, the move to private schools is very significant and marked, but it's not the same in every state. There are different grade levels at which these shifts are happening. So I think having this kind of data, and I welcome everybody in this room to take a look, because I think there is much more analytic capacity perhaps, that is in universities in India as well as outside, that can be brought to bear on this. Objections. Lots of objections. But one of the main objections comes from the education establishment in India, which says this is very simplistic and this is reductionist, and education is far more than this, which we haven't denied.
But the thing is, improving the quality of teaching and learning can be it's very, very simple. And people have dressed it up as something that's very sophisticated, and it isn't. So the same applies, I think, to improving the quality of teaching and learning in classrooms. You can work with teachers in a very, very simple way and get some big improvements. As what's that quoting? Sorry, I'm sure everyone heard.
Yeah. But the objections to what we are doing come from the fact that things are very simple. It doesn't matter that 50% of our children who are in school today have parents who haven't been to school. So for them to engage in their children's learning, not in schooling, because participation of parents in children's schooling is very high. Participation of parents in children's learning is often very difficult if they're not literate themselves, unless you make special efforts to do that. Tools like these actually are very good at trying to bring parents in. Testing in the world at large is pen and paper testing. Examinations, tests all assume that everyone can read. But if you have if you have very large numbers of children who can't read, then it's not clear what you're doing. Our tests in India, apart from the ASER tests, are also pen and paper tests. You're doing pen and paper tests in 5th grade, where repeatedly the government is doing pen and paper tests at 5th grade, when you can see that 50% of kids can't even read at the 1st grade level. It's not like they don't know anything, but this is not the way to test them. So objections or discomfort about this kind of work also comes from the testing establishment, not just in India, world over, because there are world standards which are now being imposed on everybody, whether it's PISA, whether it is, TIMSS or PEARLS. We did a TIMSS test, which is a 4th grade test in India, and forget about actually getting outcomes. I mean, it's difficult for people to understand what kind of questions those are. So I think there's a lot more that needs to be done if we indeed want to do this kind of measurement, right or wrong. It needs to be done on a different paradigm. Yuki is just having her own back at me, so she has to tell me how we should evaluate success of accountability. I think it's a very difficult question, and how will we know that we have succeeded? To some extent, I think we have succeeded because now many more people have the headache that we started off with alone. And I think that this transmitting of this headache to more people is a sign of success. So much so that we think that we are going to stop doing ASER the way we've done it for 10 years, take a break, let everybody worry about it, and then we think about what's the next area. And if many more people are talking about this and worrying about it, then perhaps. But I don't know how you do an RCT to figure that out,
Sarah, did you want to tackle any of these questions, including the kind of look at the 5 years that WASO?
The WASO data, publicly available data, is just up to 2012, so we have a shorter experience than India. But this data, luckily, there are many scientists who are based in the universities who have been interested in it and have done a lot more and presented much more interesting figures and tables and dancing things, graphs, which I can't understand, but they can, and which is really good. And which has also given us a lot more information that we knew, like, for example, on the average for children who, in Uganda, for example, the school year is supposed to take 7 years, but children spend, I think it is 11 years, because of repetition. So there's a lot of interesting information that has come from that data that has been done by other scientists. And like Rukmini said, I think we really welcome other people looking at it from different points of views. So there are some things we will do internally, but there are some that probably it doesn't serve the immediate purpose, and therefore other people will do. A lot of evidence on the rising equity gaps, especially if you look at the data across the 3 years. So that is there, and a lot more could be done. And if you're interested, I can share with you some of the titles that's available. And then maybe to just make a comment on is the right way to go the assessment way in terms of addressing these issues. I think assessment and measurement is not the end in itself. And there is before we started doing this work in this scale, there was a sort of, there's a problem. There was no urgency in doing anything at scale. Yes, there are very many small attempts of a particular college, a particular school, and there's some good stuff going on in our schools, but it is for a very small minority. So how does one expand this conversation to be able to be one that, where people can make decisions for the public school system? And this was the one route that we took. And we have seen that at least it has generated discussion that has allowed these changes to start. We now have a large-scale program, USID, DFID funded in Kenya, Tusome, where they have now starting to look at the issues that you're talking about, working more with teachers, with TAC tutors, simplifying the textbooks and other learning materials. But I don't know whether this would have happened if the scale of the problem was not seen to be that big. So it is just different ways of addressing the thing. And at least in this particular way, it has allowed at least changes and decisions to be made by those who have the ability that will benefit a number of people in the schools. Because the initial way that people dealt with it in our part was that the middle class simply took flight of the public school system and went to the private school and invested a lot more in the teachers and materials over there. And then the poor were left in their schools, so to be. But now at least there is something being done, and it is these results that showed there is a big problem. You need to invest your energies in it.
Joe, did you want to comment?
No, maybe if we move on to the next one.
Okay, let's do one more round. Oh, okay, good. We have a cluster. No? We have a cluster of questions here.
Yeah, so within the proposed Sustainable Development Goals, there's a focus on education and quality of education. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about the kind of indicators that that should be used for measuring that quality, and whether something like citizen-led assessment should play any role either at a global level or a national level within those indicators.
Hi, I'm Gina from the UCL Institute of Education. And well, I'm interested in the evaluation part. And if you could share with us some of your reflections about the challenges of using the data that you have generated in terms of looking at specific impacts, and because it's like a very complex intervention that has a lot of treatments per se. So I know that I am determined to do my research on this on this movement. So maybe if you could share with us some about these reflections about these challenges of evaluating the impact of the interventions.
Thank you, Marta from ODI. One thing that strikes me about every time I hear the story about this survey, which I find more and more interesting every time I hear more details about how you go about it, or some of the anecdote about what happens when you have conversation with policymakers, with people in the village, so how important this is to really get under the skin of why is it that there are things that are not quite working the way we think. One thing that I will be curious about is that have you got an example of where a little bit from the opposite from the Tamil Nadu example, so where things go well despite the odds, right? So you've got some relatively encouraging learning outcomes, perhaps in states or in situations where the obvious things are not happening, and if so, the extent to which the survey allows you to investigate the possible causes outside of traditional education, outside of what was being done in the school or not, whether you can get a sense of what is it that works in different contexts, where the traditional ways to do things have not been followed.
Thanks. Kevin from ODI. I'm going to try and smuggle two in really briefly, though. The first one, I mean, I'm really interested, just having read the ACE report over the last few years, what you think the impact of new entrants into the school system is. Because, you know, these are kids who are increasingly coming from the least literate, most disadvantaged households. And, you know, you had this big surge in enrollment in India after 2002, which I guess, you know, is what you're starting to pick up in 5th grade by 2008, 2009. But it does seem to me that, you know, what this points to is a systemic problem, you know, which reinforces your story, actually. It's a systemic problem in the first 2 years that, you know, you have a curriculum, a teacher training system, a school system, you know, which is failing kids critically in those first 2 years, after which all bets are off, actually. You know, it's very hard to recover that by the time you get to 5th grade, if you get that far. The second question is on the politics of this. You know, people use the evidence that you guys generate in very different ways. And some people use it to say, there you go, the state has failed. Your governments can't do this. And, you know, I mean, there's quite a big movement in that direction, actually, which some donors have jumped onto. You know, therefore we need to support voucher-based private provision. That's the way to go. You know, this is all the fault of unaccountable teachers and unaccountable state systems. It's clearly not what you're arguing. But I would be interested on your take on how this evidence plays out in the political debates in East Africa and in India.
Great. Okay, we had 4 people. We had 5 questions, including a nettlesome one about impact evaluation. You should never be asking about impact evaluation. Joe, can I start with you and then ask you to offer any reflections on these questions that you like, and then turn to Sarah, and then Rukmini, including sort of wrap-up comments, and all in a total of 10 minutes, which means 2 or 3 for you.
Okay, I think most of these questions are probably better dealt with by other members of the panel. Maybe one thing just to come back on quickly is this sort of question of using this data to sort of look at positive outcomes in places where you do have unexpected successes, which I think is quite an interesting area to explore, both in terms of, you know, understanding how you might be able to begin to adapt systems, but I mean, also a way of, you know, doing testing in a way which is not necessarily hostile to teachers, but, you know, brings them with you, that these are people who you need to convince they're the people who are going to have to do education regardless of what kind of system changes you put in place. And so, you know, celebrating where things have gone well and disseminating that kind of best practice within systems does seem to be quite crucial to me.
Great, thanks. Sarah?
Any place of citizen-led assessments? I think so, and a big one. And we've kind of summarized in this one-page green document, which I'm urging all of you to read and go and sign up on the website. But as I stated, because we are in the household, especially in our contexts in Asia, Africa, I don't know too much about Mexico, where there are children who are out of school, where do you reach them, and yet they're of the school-going age, and then you have different types of schools, and yet if you go to school-based, you'll probably just be going to the public school system. What about the other children who are going to all these other types of schools, whatever they are called, Arabic, community schools or whatnot? You will lose them out. So I think in the household, you're going to get all children, which is very important. And I think it's an ideal that all the world agrees upon, that this is a promise to all children, not only to children who are going to particular schools. And then critically also is that we are still very focused on the basics. And if you attend any meetings, like I was in meetings in the Africa Union, where they were saying we no longer want this business of focusing on basic education. This is another neo-colonialism of keeping us under. But the reality is that there are still those who do not have the basics. How will they even be able, in our part of the world, the phone is a big thing. It does many things. It's your bank account. It's your everything. How will they even be able to do that if they cannot read? So this focusing on the basics and just getting the proper information on where we are, I think is very important. If you miss that, there's a lot of planning that will not be done, will be missed. So yes, I think there is a big way, and we really would like everybody's support to ensure that this is part of it's not the only one, certainly, but I think it is a critical one that needs to be there for systems to ensure that at least you get the right understanding. Has the evidence been used in different ways that we had not envisaged? I'll just give you one example. A big thing when the Jubilee government came into Kenya was in fact, it was a political rallying. They promised that if you elect them in, every child will get a laptop. So the joke is that at a point the politicians had said maybe we needed to have changed and said it's a lollipop, not a laptop. But anyway, laptop it was. And when you attend meetings in the Ministry of Education, this is something very important for the government and for the ministry. And one of the things is that they have said, our children are not learning. Therefore, we need laptops so that we can improve on learning outcomes. We know that correlation is not that way, but it is one way in which this evidence, our evidence, has been used to justify, something that is very important for the government. And I've always asked myself, is that necessarily a bad thing? I think it's a conversation starter in which you can move on to then discuss that it doesn't work that way, this is what needs to be done. But at least you're moving somewhere than not having any discussion at all.
So very quickly on the goals, I worry a little bit that there shouldn't be so many complicated things that none of them get done. And I don't know what the name of this boy is, but one of these youth ambassador, UN youth ambassador type guys at the Global Monitoring Report launched the other day said, can we make a promise that we can keep? And I think that this focus on foundations is a promise that can be kept if we can align to say that this is really important. In our own work, we see work that has been, evaluated that it doesn't take that much to get kids with their foundations right. And so it's still a mystery to me as to why we wouldn't want to do that. So I hope there will be a focus on all children. The only place to find all children is at home, not in school. And I hope that the foundation part is not buried under many other things. I hope the goal will be very clear. And that will require some courage from part of those who are going to finally decide what these goals should be. For example, we all agree that 21st century skills are really important, but there is no consensus as yet on what that skill is. That skill in rural Bihar will be different from somewhere in Finland. And they're all going to be in the 21st century, and the 21st century is going to be of varied types in different places. This impact question is I think, an important one for us. But perhaps the way to look at it is, before we get into looking at impact and evaluation, to actually see what are the different places you want to dig deeper, and what are the kinds of things you want to study. And we would welcome and encourage, different people looking at these things. Because quantitative work is, at some level, easier to do, there is more quantitative impact evaluation. But how the involvement in this kind of work has changed, different people is not done because that's much more, harder work. So I think that we need to keep thinking about, has that impact happened, and think of different methodologies by which these can be captured. And if you look at our websites, and we have some basic documentation on the process and on the tools and so on, but very little on, the much bigger picture on which things are happening. So, what would be appropriate or useful ways in which to understand this whole phenomena would be, I think, a very valuable thing. To Marta's question, I think there are ways in which one can look at how India has changed over this period of time. There are things that I think adding what you're saying to what Kevin is saying, this kind of, the data that we have in ASER is large but not very deep. But even with that, I think there are trends that you can look at if you spend time analyzing it. For example, age distributions and effects over time. We see increasingly younger children coming into school. And that's partly because I think of this over-universalization. Everybody thinks, let me put my kids into school earlier because then they'll get more schooling and then that'll be better for them and so on and so forth. The difference between private schools and government schools is talked about a lot, but not the underlying characteristics of the children or of the schools. We see that at least in the early grades, kids in private schools are 2 years older, sometimes between 1 to 2 years older, which at that age group makes a huge difference to what they can actually gain. Private and government, the private school lobby is very quick and they are quite organized, so they can pick it up. But then we will bring out things which say actually controlling for many things, there's not that much of a difference. And then they say, your regressions must be wrong. But the fact of the matter is that there's a couple of things that the ASER data has been able to pull out, one of which is that this whole private and government distinction is actually, not the right one. I think, at least in India, we are using a massive blended strategy for how to deliver education. Some of it is happening in school, but a lot of it is not happening in school. It's happening through a large, unregulated, maybe for the right, I'm not saying regulation is necessarily a good thing, but an unorganized sector in education. It's like our manufacturing sector. Our manufacturing sector is small, vibrant, and quite entrepreneurial. Our education sector, the real action in education is also perhaps like that. And it's not studied because it's stuck in this paradigm of government and private and voucher and free, which we may have, it may or may not fit us. So we have 1 or 2 variables in ASER which talk about paid tuition. And if you look at that, there's huge patterns of that kind of behavior going on. There's a question that we used a couple of years ago about whether teachers are also paid tutors. And yes, they are in some places. So it's a government school teacher who's actually in the private sector who during school hours is delivering education in one way and outside school hours in another way. All of this is much more complicated than your black and white cases would do. So, these are all tips of the iceberg. But I think there's a lot of very interesting things happening in the education sector. One of the leading pedagogical people in India, an elderly gentleman now by the name of Professor Jalaluddin, was saying that reforming these very monolithic structures of education may be difficult. Now with the advent of technology and with this big unorganized sector we have, maybe the thing to do is to federate the tutors. Because they're younger, more nimble, they may be able to change, and people are not thinking in some of those ways. So, all of this I think points to the fact that we need much more. We need to move away from some of our usual thinking and see, try out some new clothes to see maybe you'll look better in them.
Thank you very much. So in closing, I guess I just wanted to offer a couple of comments from the perspective of the Hewlett Foundation. We've been, had the privilege of sort of accompanying and being able to support this work over many years now. And my colleague Dana Schmidt has a much longer track record of working closely with Rukmini, with Sarah, and with many other colleagues. And I think from what I've learned in the kind of opportunities that I've had to hear about this work and to see it, is how powerful an instance this is of really doing development differently. It's right at the crossroads of active engagement of citizens and achieving better outcomes in a key development area. It's a reflection of this kind of organic, ongoing partnership among countries and among professionals. Just hearing about we didn't get a chance to today, but hearing about and seeing the powerful friendship that's really thrived between ASER Pakistan and ASER India is incredibly, incredibly inspiring. And I think I can say that about all of the groups that are working on this and who have expressed an interest in wanting to work on this. And it is also, you know, a kind of lived example of the data revolution. So, Claire, that's just for you. But it's an instance where citizens are generating data. They are discovering for themselves the problems and the magnitude of problems that exist around them, and drawing attention to them in ways that I think is if not unique, it's really very special. So, you know, we've had the privilege of being able to support this work and learn from it. And so it's been great, again, to hear from you today, and I really appreciate very much the willingness of ODI to host this conversation, and I hope it's the start or the continuation of something that goes on right now over a little reception and for a much longer time with all of you. So thank you very much. Thanks to the panel.